Welcome to the second lecture of the three-lecture series on the judicial branch in the U.S. government. In this segment, we will discuss Supreme Court, which is the highest level of court in the United States. Because of the significance of this court, we will dedicate the entire segment into discussing the Supreme Court. U.S. Supreme Court is one court. So there's only one Supreme Court with 9 members in it, 9 judges in it. These judges are called justices, and one of them is considered to be the Chief Justice, and the others are considered to be associate justices. The number of justices are determined to be an odd number on purpose so that there's no tie in their rulings. And I mentioned that there's only one Supreme Court because in some political science and legal circles, there's some discussion as to whether or not it would be a good idea to have more than one Supreme Court so that the more cases could be heard by the Supreme Court. Because currently, one single court with 9 justices means a very limited number of cases can be really viewed by the court, which is roughly around 85 or so cases a year, and that's not enough for a country that has 330 million people in it, and that's also a very dynamic society that creates a lot of potential violations of constitutional rights. The main function of the U.S. Supreme Court is to ensure that the interpretation of federal laws are uniform, and they resolve conflicts among states, because remember, each state in the union has its own Supreme Court as well, and the U.S. Supreme Court is the final authority that also reviews various issues that these other courts hear. And lastly, they maintain the supremacy of law. What we mean by this third function is that the U.S. is a country with the rule of law, and the law is considered to be supreme, not the individuals, not the positions, not people's money or influence or any other feature. These are all important things that make differences, but it is the law, the Constitution, that is interpreted, and that interpretation has the final say in this country. So accordingly, Supreme Court, as the highest authority that does this job, is an institution that symbolizes the supremacy of law in the United States. U.S. Supreme Court controls its own agenda, which means that they decide, the members of the court, the justices, decide which of the nearly 10,000 or so cases they receive every year they will hear. Most of the cases come from the lower level federal courts, and vast majority of them are civil disputes, not criminal issues, since civil disputes are typically more relevant to potential constitutional violations. Chief Justice can be a new member of the court, so there's no seniority in it. One justice doesn't become a Chief Justice because he is the longest serving member of the court. He can be the newest appointee. It's all a matter of political appointment, who is considered to be the Chief Justice. In the U.S. Supreme Court, the way that individual members are chosen for this court is this simple process. First, when there's a vacancy, because of the retirement of a current justice, or maybe for health reasons, or passing away of a current justice, etc. There's a vacancy. When that happens, the Attorney General and Department of Justice first screens various candidates for the position, and then the U.S. President reviews them and nominates one of them to be the next justice, and then the U.S. Senate holds a hearing with the justice, and then after that, the Senate either confirms or rejects the nominee. Historically, about 1/5 of all nominees have been rejected to become the Supreme Court justices. It's important that the Supreme Court acts with a minimum level of politicization. It shouldn't be acting as a political actor. It should be acting as a legal actor. That's the only way to maintain the supremacy of law and the credibility of the court. And to help accomplish depoliticization of the U.S. Supreme Court, there are two main mechanisms. One is that the justices to the court are appointed to their positions instead of elected to them. So that way they don't have to run in elections and become political actors, running under a particular political party, identifying as a member of a party, and to win the elections. Secondly, justices are appointed to their positions for life rather than limited terms. So once they're appointed, they are there until they die or choose to retire or step down for any other reason, but they are not on a temporary assignment as our political leaders are. But having said that, of course, just like any other citizen, members of the Supreme Court, the justices, are also political actors in many ways. They have their political leanings, their particular worldviews, and they reflect those political priorities in their rulings as well. One example on the political significance of the court was the 2016 case when one of the justices on the court, on the bench, Justice Scalia, passed away. The U.S. president at the time, President Obama, nominated Merrick Garland as the person to replace Justice Scalia. However, the Senate, U.S. Senate, was under Republican leadership at the time, and the Republican leadership refused to hold a hearing on Justice Garland, and they held it for nearly one whole year. They did not put it on the Senate's calendar. And then so that the next presidential elections would be held, and there would be a 50% chance that a Republican president would take office, and as a result, a Republican president would nominate a more conservative-leaning justice to the position. And this prediction played out perfectly, and the Republican Donald Trump got elected, as you know, in 2016, and he turned around and nominated Brett Kavanaugh as a conservative-minded justice, and currently Mr. Kavanaugh is the latest and the newest justice in the U.S. Supreme Court, and as a result, the court's overall political leaning shifted from a balance to a more conservative leaning. But having said that, we don't want to make a mistake of assigning particular political positions to each justice. That would be unfair. When we look at the data, we see that U.S. Supreme Court justices are only somewhat partisan in their rulings. So in this graph here, there is for example, we can see the political party affiliation of the president who nominated various court justices, and in what percent of the rulings these justices voted for that party. This graph shows that. So going down, for example, you see Justice Ginsburg, and you see that a liberal president, Bill Clinton, nominated her, and she voted only 37% of the time conservative. So this was predictable with Mr. Clinton's expectations, perhaps. She acted as a liberal justice, but this means that more than a third of the time she still acted as adopted a conservative viewpoint. And the same thing applies for all others as well. Generally speaking, we see that there's not 100% correlation between the the president's political leaning and the justice's political leaning. There is just an association, but it's not 100%. U.S. Supreme Court historically has been mostly white and older males. Out of the 113 justices, 107 of them have fit this criteria. But in recent years, it has increasingly become more diverse. Today, there are 3 female, 1 African American, and 1 Latino American justices in the court. 5 of them are Catholics, 3 are Jewish, and 1 is Episcopalian. However, in their educational background, it's hard to say that there is a diversity. All these 9 justices come from one of the 3 law schools, and Harvard, Yale, and Columbia law schools are where they have their degrees from. Some people argue that this is predictable since these are the top law schools in the nation, but some others argue that the United States has more than 3,300 colleges and universities, and it's not only 3 of them that provide top-level legal education. So therefore, graduates of many other top-level law schools should also be considered for Supreme Court justices. Their educational backgrounds shouldn't be as concentrated as it is today. Court's agenda. The Supreme Court, as I mentioned, receives 8,000 or so cases a year. In some years, it's as high as 10,000. These are applications to the court, and some of them come from state courts, some from lower-level federal courts, and all these issues are discussed in a conference, and the vast majority, 99% of them, are denied, and only 1% are approved to be heard by the court. If 4 of the justices agree that a particular case should be heard by the court, then it's put on the court's docket, which is a list of cases that will be heard by the court. And as I mentioned earlier, fewer than 100 cases, and I think the historical average is around 85 or so. 85 cases are heard by the U.S. Supreme Court every year. This wraps up the second of the 3 lectures on the U.S. judicial branch. Thank you.